friends. I am so excited about today's lesson because I'm coming to you straight from a beehive. How crazy is this? We're going to continue our insect lessons from home. So it's going to be very similar to what we have been doing in class, but we get to add some virtual things, which should make it a little more fun. So before we start though, let's go over what we've already learned about insects. Insects, if you remember correctly, their bodies have three major parts. So we talked about them having the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. So three major parts. And there's our praying mantis. We can see the head, thorax, and abdomen. I also have the ant. That's a little easier to see. The head, thorax, and abdomen. So three main parts. Remember, head, thorax, abdomen, abdomen. That little song we sung. So another thing that all insects have are the same number of legs, and the ant is very good at showing us this too. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 6 legs. We also talked about it being 3 pairs of legs because a pair is 2. So 2, 4, 6. 6 legs. And there's one thing that a lot of insects also have. And, oh gosh, what was that one? Oh, right. A lot of insects have antennae. So 2, right, top of their head, help them with lots of different tasks to keep them doing their best job and getting what they need to survive. So we're shifting gears a little bit today, and as you've probably guessed, we are going to be talking about bees today, which I know a lot of you are familiar with because you were all really excited the last time we left off that bees were the next. So we'll take a little glimpse into the world of a bee. So as you're listening, I want you to think about how a bee is similar and different from some of the other insects that we've talked about. Enjoy. Okay friends, so today we are going to learn about social insects, bees and wasps. And the last lesson we talked about the difference between social and solitary, and remembering that social insects live in groups and solitary insects live alone. So since we're going to be reading about social insects, about bees and wasps, we're going to be talking about how and why they live in groups. So as you're listening today, I want you to learn about the 3 types of honeybees and paper wasps: workers, drones, and queens. And I want you to listen carefully to what each of their jobs do and why they're important to their insect group. Bzz, bzz. Oh, you startled me. I'm so busy that I nearly forgot where I was. I'm a honeybee, and I'm delighted to be here to tell you a little bit about my everyday world. Honeybees are quite social. Humans are social too, which means that they live together in communities or groups instead of living alone. Social insects live in communities too. Most insects are solitary, living alone their entire lives. They are alone when they hatch from their eggs. They search for food alone, and they find their own shelter. There are thousands of different kinds of bees on the planet, and most of them live solitary lives. But honeybees are different. We live together in organized communities and depend upon one another to live, solving problems as a team. We gather and share food, build nests together, cooperate to raise our young, and help protect one another from enemies. Honeybee communities are called colonies. Our colonies are made up of 20,000 or more bees. We like to make our nests or beehives in dark places. That's why you often see pictures of us buzzing around the trunks of hollow trees. People use beehive boxes to raise honeybees for honey. Perhaps you've seen these boxes in a field, orchard, or your backyard. Wherever we nest, we build honeycombs. This amazing structure of layered is made from a waxy substance that we produce in our abdomens. Can you spot a pattern among the cells in this honeycomb? They are all six-sided. What purpose do all these cells serve? These cells are very important to our lives. Listen carefully, and I'll tell you how they are important to the many jobs we perform. Remember, I told you we're very social insects and very busy. There is lots of work to be done, and each bee in the colony has its own job to do. Every honeybee colony has a mother called the queen bee. The queen is always the largest bee in the hive, and she has only one job to do. She must lay eggs, lots and lots of eggs. She must produce more queens for other hives and make sure there are enough worker bees to do the work in her own hive. The queen bee flies from the nest to mate with male bees called drones. Once a drone has mated with the queen bee, it has done its job and it dies. Drones cannot sting because they don't have stingers. When the queen returns, she lays her eggs, sometimes more than 1,000 eggs a day. Where do you think that queen bee lays all her eggs? Right, she returns to the comb to lay them in the cells. The queen then pushes tiny eggs, no bigger than a pinhead, from her abdomen into the waxy cells of the honeycomb, one egg to each cell. Remember that the abdomen is this part of the honeybee. In just a few days, the eggs hatch. The larvae get fed pollen by one of the hive's female worker bees. So pollen's a fine, powdery substance that's produced by flowers, and I'm sure you've seen it before, especially in the spring and summertime. The larvae grow and eventually spin silky cocoons. Worker bees quickly seal over the small waxy cells of the honeycomb, protecting the developing pupa inside each cocoon. Does this process sound familiar? It should. The bees are undergoing a change. When they emerge from their cocoons, they'll chew their way out of the cells, emerging as full-grown adults. Most of the new adults are female worker bees. They only live for a few months, and they spend their whole lives working hard to keep the hive running well. They keep the hive clean. They serve as nurse bees, tending to the larvae. They make new cells and repair old ones, and they store nectar and pollen that others bring back to the hive. After several weeks working inside the hive, these hard-working females go outside to serve as guards, protecting the hive from enemies and bees from other hives. Each hive has its own special chemical scent or smell, so it's easy to tell who doesn't belong in a hive. Near the end of her life, a worker bee becomes a forager bee, collecting a sweet juice from flowers. This juice, or nectar, is used to make honey. Foraging worker bees have keen senses of smell and sight, and very good memories. They may visit thousands of flowers each day to find the best nectar. When a bee discovers a particularly good source of nectar, it returns to the hive to share its information with other foragers. First, it lets the other foragers smell the pollen so that they can identify the type of flower. Then it performs a complicated and special waggle dance. As it circles about in a pattern like a figure 8, it waggles its abdomen as it moves through the middle of its dance. The bee's repeated movements, circling and waggling its abdomen, tell the others exactly how far away and in which direction from the sun the flowers are located. A bee that thinks she's found a really good flower patch does the waggle dance with lots of energy. Where do you suppose the bees put the nectar when they return to the hive? They make the nectar into honey and store it in the honey cells, the cells that are not being used for developing bees. The honey is an important food source for the bees. While moving from flower to flower, worker bees rub up against a yellow powder called pollen. Honeybees will pack the pollen into baskets of hair on their hind legs, and then they carry it with them. Pollen is used to feed the larvae, but the pollen is important stuff for another reason. Plants need pollen from other plants in order to make new seeds. This is called pollination. Honeybees are important because they carry the pollen between flowers of the same species or kind. I'd like to introduce you to a relative of mine. This is a paper wasp. Look closely at its body next to mine. What do we have in common? We each have a head. We each have a thorax with 6 legs, an abdomen, an exoskeleton, and wings. And this particular wasp, the paper wasp, is a social insect just like me. Some wasps are solitary, but the black and gold ones nearly always live in societies. Like honeybees, wasps live in large groups. What are these groups called? Yes, wasps live in colonies. Each colony has a leader, a female wasp who is bigger than all the other wasps and who spends most of her time laying eggs. Sound familiar? What do you think she's called? Yes, she is the queen. Like honeybees, wasps build nests. They build them in many different places, usually in hidden, difficult-to-see places that are protected from rain and bad weather, such as under the eaves of a house or in protected areas on trees. Wasp nests have a very different look from beehives on the outside, but their paper-like structures are similar to ours on the inside. We'll take a look at how paper wasps build their nest. The process begins with the queen. She finds plant fibers, dry grasses, old boards, fence posts, and pulls them apart with her strong jaws. She softens the splintery pieces with saliva inside her mouth and chews them into a paste that looks and feels a little like paper. Then she sticks a dab of this paste to whatever surface she has chosen for her nest. The queen adds a tough cell to support the whole nest and begins attaching cone-like chambers to it. These clusters of 6-sided chambers open downward to keep the rain out. As the queen forms each chamber, she deposits an egg into each one. The eggs developed into larvae. The queen wasp takes care of the first larvae herself. She leaves the nest to find food, capturing and chewing other insects into mush to feed her young. About 2 weeks after hatching, the larvae enter the pupa stage, spinning cocoons inside each cell and covering the cells with silk. These sealed cells break open a few weeks later and out come adult wasps with long legs, strong wings, and large eyes. Most of these newly hatched wasps are female workers who begin to take over the queen's work right away. They hunt for food and feed the larvae, clean and repair the cells, and guard the nest. Others fan the nest with beating wings, and some even spread water over the combs to keep the nest cool. While the workers enlarge the nest for more and more wasps, the queen goes back to laying eggs. By summer's end, many of the workers have died. There are often 250 or more cells inside the wasp papery nest. The wasps that do emerge at the end of summer are no longer female worker wasps. Instead, they are the new queens and males. The new queens find shelter in protected places, in attic walls, inside logs, under bushes, where they hibernate all winter. When spring comes, the new queens come out from hiding and begin building nests for new colonies of wasps. All wasps abandon their nests in fall, using them for one season only. When fall comes and the leaves drop from the trees, look up and see if you can spot one of their papery apartment houses dangling from underneath a roof or partially hidden behind a wall. Next time, you'll find out how some other social insects build their nest. Until then, be thinking about who they might be. All right, so here we have some bees, and we've got one that's really realistic looking. These two not so much, but they're great for what we're going to do today. So the Read Aloud mentioned that the biggest bee in the hive is the queen, so we'll call this one the queen. And her job, of course, is to just lay eggs. That's her only job. So she leaves her nest and meets up with the drone bee. They mate. The drone bee, that's his only job, and unfortunately he dies. They don't live very long. And so the queen bee comes back to the hive and she lays one egg in each cell, and the egg is only about the size of the head of a pin, so it's very, very small in each cell. She lays all the eggs and then she leaves because she's still going to be making more eggs. And the worker bees then take over the care for the young in the cell. So after a few days, the egg starts to grow. It's getting bigger. You can kind of see here in this picture. It's looking a little bit more like larvae there. And the queen is laying over 1,000 eggs. So there's a lot of worker bees taking care of a lot of different eggs in their cells. Once they're hatched, they get fed pollen by one of the worker bees. So they're fed pollen. And they grow and they grow and they start getting bigger and bigger, bigger. And they look kind of similar to a caterpillar, sort of, here. This would all still be happening inside its own individual cell. Okay. It's turning definitely into larva, and it's growing. It eventually spins a silky cocoon. Okay. And once this stage happens, the worker bee is going to seal off the cell. They're not feeding it anymore. Seal off the cell, protecting it, protecting the pupa inside. And it sounds very close to, right? The pupa is going inside. It's going to make a big change. It's going to sound really close to what we're talking about with a butterfly in a complete metamorphosis. So at this point, of course, it's still in the cocoon and it's forming. A transformation is happening. We can see there's legs forming. The mouth parts are visible. There's eyes. You can definitely tell that there's a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. There's little wing buds starting here. And it's going to continue to complete that metamorphosis. And then eventually it's going to emerge as a bee, as an adult bee. Now, most of them are going to end up being worker bees. And the worker bee is really one of the most important bees to the hive because they do so many things. They keep the hive running well. They are cleaning the hive. They're tending to the larvae. They make new cells. They store the nectar and pollens that other bees bring back to the hive. They keep going outside as guards, so they're guarding the hive from any enemies. The worker bee really has a hard job, and they only live for a couple months at a time. So the worker bee is really helping to run that hive. So we talked about the queen bee helping by laying egg, and there's only one of those per hive. We talked about the worker bee, that this is the majority of the bees. The most of the bees in the hive are worker bees, and they have a lot to do. And then we also have drone bees who don't live very long at all, but are necessary in order to mate with the queen bee so that she can lay new eggs.